Welcome to the premiere episode of the Burg podcast, where we talk about all things Hattiesburg, Mississippi. Also known as the Hub City or just the Burg, Hattiesburg is a bustling town in southern Mississippi. It's an educational, cultural, business, and medical hub for the region, and we're pleased to share a few stories from our community.
On today's episode of the Burg podcast, we focus on three people whose pathway led them to the classroom. First, we have Aiden Tarrant and his interview with Associate Professor Dr. Heather Sturr.
I'm Aiden Tarrant for the Burg podcast. Today I'm interviewing Dr. Heather Sturr. My guest is a professor of history, a published author, etc., mostly on the Vietnam War. So, thank you so much for doing this.
Oh, you're welcome, Aiden. Glad to do it.
So, when you were growing up, what made you interested in history?
Well, it comes from my family background. My parents grew up in the Vietnam. They are of the Vietnam War generation, and I, as a child, grew up hearing them talk about kids who they knew in high school who went to Vietnam and either didn't come back or they came back and struggled to deal with what they had experienced there. My dad actually didn't end up having to go. But I always remember them talking about these kids that they knew. And I remember my grandparents talking about being concerned about would their sons have to go and those sorts of things. And so that just sparked my interest in this thing, the Vietnam War. I realized it was something that was important to my parents' generation. And this is kind of funny, but growing up in the 1980s, there were a lot of Vietnam War movies that were being made, like Platoon and Full Metal Jacket and those movies. And so, again, that just added to my understanding of the fact that this had to be something that was significant to this generation of people. And then when I was in college, I took a class on the Vietnam War, and I was super fascinated by it. I loved the professor, and I loved the subject matter. And as I went along in college, I decided, okay, I want to study this period, and I want to be a professor. I want to be like these people who seem to be doing something that's so cool. Being on a college campus, studying a really fascinating and controversial aspect of American history. And so that really is what led me into it. And so when I graduated college, I actually took a few years off and worked as a newspaper reporter. But it was always in the back of my mind that I wanted to be a history professor and study the Vietnam War. And so I ended up going to graduate school and got my PhD. And my first job out of graduate school was at Southern Miss. And I've been here ever since.
Cool. Yeah, my grandparents have similar stuff. I mean, none of them served in Vietnam. My grandfather got to do mandatory service in the early 60s, so he kind of lucked out. But, so you've written many historical books and countless other things about the war. What is like your magnum opus of research, or what? Like, what's like the thing you're most proud of that you've done in the field?
Yeah, so I'll say a little bit about what I've done, and then I'll talk about something that, in a couple of ways that things are significant to me. I've written about women in the Vietnam War. That was my first book that I wrote, Beyond Combat. And then after I finished that, I really wanted to do something on the South Vietnamese perspectives regarding the war. I knew that there were lots of people who were different from what we've been told in the Vietnam War story, and I wanted to know what their perspectives were on the war. And so I had learned Vietnamese when I was in graduate school, but I didn't really keep up with it, as I didn't have the opportunity to go to Vietnam to study while I was in graduate school. So I didn't really keep up with it. But then when I was employed here at Southern Miss, I got a Fulbright fellowship, which was through the U.S. State Department. And so I was able to go and live for a year in Vietnam, teach at a university there, and do research and work with a private tutor on my Vietnamese language. So I was able to learn the language better than what I had done in graduate school. And I used Vietnamese archives to learn about the South Vietnamese perspectives on the war. And so that was my second book, Saigon at War, looking at those perspectives. And then I have a couple of other things that are different from the Vietnam War. One side interest is that I've been interested in issues of military integration. So how the U.S. military has integrated racial minorities, women, gays and lesbians, and then most recently transgender people. And so I wrote a book on that kind of around the same time that I wrote Saigon at War. And then most recent book that I wrote is moving into the 21st century about the U.S. Army 3rd Infantry Division's invasion of Iraq in 2003. And the capture of Baghdad and the dismantling the Saddam Hussein regime. and the experience of those soldiers led by General Buford Blunt, who was actually a graduate of Southern Miss, but he led the 3rd Infantry Division into Baghdad. So it was partially about him and partially about the division and its invasion of Baghdad and the operations leading to the fall of Baghdad. So I moved into the 20th century for that book, but I remain very interested in the Vietnam War, and the Baghdad book just came out in August, so I haven't decided what my next project is. But I guess to speak to your question about what is something that I think is the most significant that I've done, I would probably say it's Saigon at War, because one, it required me to learn Vietnamese and be able to research in Vietnamese archives, and go through all those processes, which was different than something I had ever done before. And I think it really contributed a new perspective on the war, because historians really haven't they've looked at Americans' experience in the Vietnam War and groups like the National Liberation Front and the North Vietnamese, but really not so much about the South Vietnamese side of the story. So I felt like that was an important contribution. I do think I am really proud of the Baghdad book too, because it's really the first historical book to look at that event. It just happened 20 years ago. So historians haven't really been considering it to be history yet. So that I felt like that was important as well, to kind of lead the historical investigation into that experience.
Cool. So it seems like this probably started with the baby boomer generation, but in my lifetime, the Vietnam War has always been like represented as sort of this event that has started the decline of like the American empire. And I'm wondering if there's like, what do you think the main lesson, I mean, I don't know if you think that's accurate or not, but what's like the main lesson we can take away from Vietnam? Like, do you think it was a mistake, or, it's complicated.
Yeah.
And there's hindsight and all this stuff, but it just seems like there's this idea that Vietnam was like this big mistake, and it really has had bad effects.
Yeah, I mean, from our perspective, and you're right to say that we have the benefit of hindsight looking at this. From our perspective now, it's difficult to justify the extent to which the U.S. intervened in Vietnam. I think from the perspective of that time, we can understand that things like the threat of communism and the loss of influence in Asia were some things that were significant to Americans' understanding about their interests and their standing in the world. I think where we can say the U.S. it's harder to justify the U.S. intervention when we look at the numbers of troops who were sent over there. So we might say, okay, the United States was sending money and even sending training aid and that sort of thing to try to train a Vietnamese military to fight communist insurgency. We can understand why the U.S. would do that. If the U.S. sees South Vietnam as an ally, the U.S. has history of doing that, of training allied forces to protect their own security and protect their government and protect their stability in that. But because the U.S. was interested in ultimately providing independence, the U.S. got in the way of doing that by making it its own war. That maybe what the U.S. needed to do was train the South Vietnamese military, offer advice to the South Vietnamese government, and then after that, whatever happens is up to the Vietnamese. And if it means that the communist Hanoi government took control of South Vietnam sooner, well, so be it. But I think where the U.S. maybe where we could find mistakes is in the decisions to commit so many troops. I mean, 2 million Americans served there over the course of the war. Over 55,000 Americans died there, and the outcome was the same as it would have been if the U.S. never committed military troops, which is Hanoi won the war. And so it's difficult to justify the deaths that occurred in the war when the outcome was the same as it would have been if the U.S. hadn't committed militarily. So was it a mistake? I think, so there's a couple ways to look at this. On the one hand, yes, you might say, yeah, those 55,000 plus lives were a mistake. I mean, you think about those, mostly men, a few women, but those Americans who, today might be grandparents and never got to experience that. On the other hand, I think there's an argument to be made that if we say it was a mistake, then that cheapens the loss of those soldiers and the work that they were doing in support of their country. So, but I think probably there was a chance that the U.S. could have gotten out before it committed all those American lives.
So moving on to a more fun topic, what is your personal favorite movie about Vietnam? It doesn't have to be super accurate or anything. Just something,
My favorite movie is The Deer Hunter, and the reason for that is because it takes place in, I think it's Pittsburgh, but it takes place in basically the Rust Belt part of the country. So I grew up in Northwest Indiana, which is very much like that. So it's steel mills. Eastern European, your immigrant population. So my family comes from Poland, Czechoslovakia, mostly that part of the country. My grandparents and my parents were working class, blue collar, and then my parents eventually, guys, you would say they moved into the suburbs and became white collar. But that kind of blue collar experience was very much my parents' experience growing up, and my grandparents working in steel mills. And so to me, it depicts how the Vietnam War affected a part of the U.S. that was like where my family came from. So that's why I usually, if somebody asks me this question, I say The Deer Hunter is my favorite Vietnam War movie.
It's cool. I've seen it. Any future plans coming up in regards to your work? Are you writing? I think I read somewhere you're writing a book or something, or...
Yeah, it might have been the Baghdad book because that one just came out. I mean, something that I think a lot about is that 2025 will be the 50th anniversary of the fall of Saigon, the end of the Vietnam War. And so I've thought a lot about writing something about either about the experience of the fall of Saigon or the aftermath of that, either dealing with maybe the last Americans who were there in Saigon or dealing with the last Vietnamese to get out. So I may write something on that to try and coincide with that, with the 50th anniversary of the fall of Saigon. So that's kind of what I'm thinking about now. I am interested in U.S. relations in the Middle East, which really kind of came even more of an interest after I wrote the Baghdad book. But I do find myself always going back to the Vietnam War. So I think probably something about 1975 will be the next thing I write. And I suppose I got to get on that now since it's been a few months since this book has come out. So it's the first time in 15 years that I really haven't had a solid book project, but I'm going to get back on that. I'm enjoying just focusing on teaching, though, right now. So that's been a lot of fun.
That's nice. I hope you are able to do it because it seems like your work is pretty good in regards to the war. So,
well, thanks. I appreciate that.
Well, thank you so much for talking with us. I'm Aiden Tarrant for the Burg podcast.
Thanks for having me, Aiden.
For our next segment, Anna Philpott has a personal essay explaining how a trip to Spain led her to discover her true passion and motivated her to chase her dream.
For as long as I can remember, my biggest wish has been to travel the world. I always thought that if I ever had the chance for international travel, it would be far off in the future after months and years of saving. As someone who grew up in a middle-class Mississippi household, there was a part of me that was unsure I'd ever get to travel to a place like Europe. But when I got to college and started hearing about studying abroad, my dreams got a whole lot closer. 2 years ago around this time, I started building my dream summer where I'd spend the first half working as a counselor at a camp I loved, and the second half in Cadiz, Spain. The puzzle pieces came together, and soon enough, I was in the airport checking the bag I would live out of for the next month. Little did I know, these 4 short weeks would alter the course of my life forever. After 24 hours of travel, we boarded a train that took us through the Spanish countryside from Madrid all the way down to the arid south. I watched as the concrete turned to green hills, which turned to endless fields of olive trees. It's important to note that I had spent the last month and a half working in a microscopic Alabama town, doing things like picking blueberries and spending the night outside in my hammock. As much of a nightmare as that may sound to some people, it served as a haven to me before I set out on my European girl summer. It goes without saying that the turnaround from camp counselor to city tourist was abrupt due to such a radical shift in routines. In spite of such obvious differences, there are also many subtle similarities between Lineville and Cadiz that make me smile. On the train, I imagined myself and the campers picking olives off the trees and popping them into our mouths, morning dew and all. When we finally set our bags down in the dorm, El Colegio Mayor, we turned around and took a tour of the city. While at first the native tongue of the tour guide was lost on me, I'd soon come to know the streets and landmarks as though I'd put them there. Cadiz is a tiny pocket of gold found in the southwest corner of the Iberian Peninsula, or, rather, a little cup of silver, like its famous nickname says. One can find pieces of its rich history in every inch, from the stones used in the buildings, the patterns on the tiles, or even the cannons on some street corners. I experienced certain freedoms that I didn't realize my life lacked, like walking from one end of the city to the other without taking a car or bus, or hitting the beach after class while the sun baked us alive. I was getting ice cream every day of the week and never feeling bad about it. My friend and I could sit at a table with 2 glasses and a bowl of olives and watch some children play soccer nearby. I am always amazed remembering the overwhelming amount of free time I had. Even while taking classes, I found myself with hours to spare to do nothing but enjoy them how I wanted to. I bought art supplies and painted on the beach. I went to the plaza to buy flowers. I spent an hour watching the sunset because it just never seemed to get fully dark outside. My friends and I shared stories, laughs, and tears until we had no more. There are countless memories stored in my head from that tiny city in southern Spain that will always be precious to me. But the thing about my time studying abroad that means the most to me is the impact that it has had on my life as a whole. As cliché as it may sound, studying abroad completely changed my life. The time was approaching for our final exam, and everyone got together at a conference table we'd formed on the patio to review. I found my calling that night. I knew I wanted to be a Spanish teacher, and the realization made so much sense to me. When I was little, I wanted to be a teacher, up until I learned about salaries. When I was preparing to go to Ecuador on a mission trip a few summers back, I was printing handouts of vocabulary to our entire group. When people asked me what I wanted to do with my psychology degree, I always told them, teach English in South America, which arguably has no correlation. However, I wondered if this realization was just a case of rose-colored lenses. I sat through another semester of psychology courses where I found myself with no vigor for the field and wishing I was in a Spanish class. I contemplated changing my major to Spanish licensure and adding on who knows how much time. I wondered if I'd ever be able to learn Spanish well enough to teach it. In the end, I did what my heart told me to and officially changed my major to pursue the passion I'd ignored for so long. And don't be fooled. No study abroad trip is perfect, and I faced my fair share of challenges. But despite any hiccups, big or small, I will always have Cadiz to thank for setting me on the path I was always meant to be on. No souvenir will ever amount to everything that I took from Spain, or rather, what Spain gave to me. I learned so much about the world, about people, about myself. Studying abroad brought me to really value a walk, trying new things, an ice cream cone, a foreign language, and especially spending time with the people I love. Money will always come back, but memories never will. It's been a year since I changed my major, and countless doors have been opened for me. It looks like I'll get to pursue my dream of traveling the world after all. This is Anna for the Burg Podcast.
Lastly, a Southern Miss Associated Professor of Sociology is one of the leading voices advocating for diversity, equality, and inclusion efforts on this campus. Sophia LaPalm has more on Dr. Carrie Kelzowski and how she got her start in advocating for social justice.
Dr. Carrie Kelzowski grew up in a small town that was home to mostly white, upper-middle-class families, where she was surrounded by people who looked like her. After graduating college, she started working as a legal education outreach coordinator at a free legal clinic in Indianapolis, Indiana. She worked closely with Burmese refugees so her clinic could better understand how to assist them as they adjusted to life in America.
I spent a year getting to know the Burmese refugee population in Indianapolis. I got to know their community leaders, their elders. I spent time teaching English as a second language in some of the local libraries where a lot of the population was housed.
Kelzowski was shocked to learn that the Burmese refugees were expected to survive in America with only 6 months of government assistance and little knowledge of the country's laws or language. The Burmese refugee community was hardworking and optimistic about their future, even though they were farmers by trade who are now living in an urban area.
As optimistic and as grateful as they were, I didn't have a lot of high hopes that they were going to be able to live the version of the American dream that I had been taught existed for everybody, not the American dream that I got to have.
After learning about the struggles the Burmese refugee community faced in America, she went to graduate school to learn more about racial and structural inequalities. The education system is supposed to be the great equalizer in America, but Kelzowski believed it only widened the gap between different ethnic groups and social classes. She studied the inequalities present in the education system to deepen her understanding of the origins of more complex socioeconomic problems.
Felt like I really need to understand how inequality happened in education. That's why I study socioeconomic and racial inequality in education. It's why I am committed to trying to provide the best quality education that I can as a professor at an institution like Southern Miss.
Education can be used to break barriers or create them, a sentiment that is very relevant to diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts on college campuses like USM. Kozlowski's experiences working with Burmese refugees taught her that not everyone has equal access to the American dream. Even though many years have passed, she still remembers the optimism and resilience the Burmese refugees showed in the face of adversity. Kozlowski works hard to instill a similar hope in all the students she teaches at USM, passing on her dream that education will continue to break barriers in society. I'm Sophia LaPalme, reporting for the Burg Podcast.
Thank you for tuning in to the Burg Podcast. This podcast is totally produced by students in Dr. Dave Davies' MCJ 344 podcasting class in the School of Media and Communication at the University of Southern Mississippi. Producers for this episode are Madison Calkins, Sydney Stokes, Michaelan Williams, and Denari Washington. Music from Upbeat. See the link in our About page for more information. Cover artwork by Madison Calkins and Greta Graves.